Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our second stakeholder group meeting. Today, we're here to talk about revenue sufficiency. And I just want to welcome all of you back and thank you again for being part of this team. And thank you for all your input last week and your willingness to jump right into questions and have a discussion about what we're doing and how we go about establishing rates and that sort of thing. We're hoping to have the same sort of discussion today, and I see we already have a couple questions that were posted in the chat, so you can feel free to use that. As Steve mentioned, a reminder that these meetings are being recorded for future reference and for others to view, so you want to be cognizant of that. With that, I will forego all the lengthy introductions from last time, but again, encourage you to submit your questions either via the chat or chime in when there's breaks during the presentation where there's specific questions. By all means, feel free to unmute and ask your question directly. On that note, if you're not speaking or asking a question, it's helpful to mute your microphone. We get a lot of background noise and otherwise, so I'm going to do that as well. But with that, if there are no initial questions, I'm going to turn it over to our consultant group, Andy, Kyle, and Deb. So Andy, it's all yours.
Perfect. Thanks, Terry. Well, it's been a short week since we last had the opportunity to chat, and last week was kind of a rate study 101 conversation that really oriented us to some things about Tempe's water and sewer utilities, the rate making process overall, and some industry trends and some data points and things that we'll want to look at as we embark upon the study. But one of the fundamental things that we talked about was really kind of the process that we were embarking on in a rate study. That's really focused on kind of three key questions. And this is a little bit of a recap from the first session that we had. But really the intent of a rate study investigation like this is to understand how much revenue do we need to cover our cost requirements? How should we allocate that to our different customer classes fairly and equitably? And how do we then recover that or collect the revenue via a rate structure with fixed and variable charges? And as we indicated at the Rates 101 session, we're really going to try to break down this process to focus on each of those three key questions. And so today's discussion is really focused on that first question of how much revenue do we need for our system to cover our operations, capital costs, make sure we have adequate liquidity and reserves for unplanned or future events. And so today's discussion is really all about revenue sufficiency. So Kyle, if you go to the next one. And so we talked a little bit last time about the components of the revenue requirement for utility systems and highlighted the fact that they include a great variety of different things, whether it's operations and maintenance expenses, making sure we have adequate reserves for operating and capital, factoring in our future capital improvement requirements, those that we pay for with cash, and those that we also incur debt to pay for that we then subsequently have a principal and interest repayment expense. And then also minor capital outlays for equipment and vehicles and those sorts of things. And the two kind of colored diagrams here for purchased water and sub-regional operating costs for wastewater, those are two kind of very big cost requirements that are to a certain extent things that are outside of our specific control that we have as cost requirements here in Tempe to make sure that we have adequate water to supply to citizens and businesses, but then also that we have adequate infrastructure to subsequently treat and dispose of the wastewater from the community as a whole as well. And so on the next slide, Kyle, one of the things that I wanted to kind of set the stage for today is kind of what we're going to cover for each utility system. So we've broken the discussion today into two parts, one focusing on the water system and then another focusing on the sewer system. And both parts are going to be discussing and presenting the source data, the assumptions, information about what we're seeing with current customer statistics, trends and revenues, some discussion on the multi-year capital improvement requirements, and is going to conclude with a review of the preliminary financial plans and actually a few different ways that we can look at things, whether it's evaluating the status quo, what rates would look like on a just-in-time basis to meet our requirements exactly as they occur, or what we often term a more levelized or gradual approach. And we're going to have hopefully a good dialogue about understanding of what are the exact cost requirements that we have for the system, what are our options, and understanding of what it's going to take to fund those different expenditure requirements. And so as Terry indicated, we'd love to have questions and comments along the way. Sometimes, might come to you right in the middle as Kyle or I are talking, and so it may be easier to chat. Other times there might be a pretty natural break in the presentation that you might be able to offer that verbally, and we'd welcome really either form of participation. That's really the intent of these sessions. So before I turn it over to Kyle to get into the water system first, I just wanted to remind everyone about a couple of things that do cause challenges for utility systems on an ongoing basis. Utilities have not only operational cost inflation, but continued changes in water use, notwithstanding the fact that we have a significant amount of underground infrastructure and staffing levels that we have to maintain, and a significant amount of investment in that underground infrastructure and even above ground infrastructure to make sure that we have and can meet customers' expectations for and the community's expectations for level of service. And so what this often results in for a lot of utilities are rate increases that we talked about last time that are above the general rate of inflation. And we'd highlighted, these reasons as part of last time. So, we'll continue to come back to these themes too, but I think it's important for a fundamental understanding through this process for us all to recognize that utility systems are going to be continuing to face all across the country, and the city of Tempe is not unique in this regard, challenges that cause upward pressure on rates over time that make it very difficult to have a sustainable financial forecast that can meet level of service expectations without future rate adjustments to keep pace with these items. So I just want to put that out there at kind of the onset before Kyle starts walking us through the water system to give us a bit of an orientation and a little bit of background. So unless there's kind of questions on the big picture, what I'd like to do is to hand it over to Kyle, our project manager for the study, to start going through the analysis. And if there's detailed questions, Deb, who's our lead consultant, is also on the phone. She may be able to pull up some additional details and information along the way. And of course, city staff is here to help and participate as well. So that, Kyle, maybe you could start kind of walking through the water system, and we'll get into things.
Perfect. Yeah, perfect, Andy. Happy to pick it up. So with regards to the water system, we've got a few slides. I wanted to put this first one up to just give us some kind of guiding information about the system. It's really in a community, oftentimes we don't see the system or the scale of the system, being that so much of it is buried. And so just put some of the big descriptors up here. When you add up, the one that really sticks out to me is that second one. When you add up all the miles of pipe back to back, we're talking about 850 miles of water lines. There's a lot of pipes in the ground, and it's a relatively complex distributed system that we're looking at trying to fund and understand all the operating costs that go into it over a multi-year period. And so just figured I'd flash that up, give you an idea of the large kind of scope items related to the water system. If we dig into some of the first details, one that might come up is, how many questions do we have? How do we provide service? And so this first slide is really teeing up on the left in the tabular format, our customer classes. So up at the very top, and let me get my little laser pointer, which helps out. At the very top, we've got 6 different customer classes: single family, multi-commercial, industrial, landscape, and construction. And as we go through this study, we're going to continue to talk about those individual customer classes, and the next steps in the analysis will go deeper and deeper into the analysis with concern with them. But really what I want you to take away here is, from a customer standpoint, a few different dynamics. We've got the size of the connection here. So this is the number, or this is the size of the meter that's connected to Tempe's municipal water system. And then if you quickly just take the number of customers and throw it into a pie chart like this, what this starts to display for us is single family is a really dominant customer class if you just go by the number of connections. Then we have multifamily, commercial, and smaller numbers of customer for industrial or landscape. Now, if we go to the next slide, though, and we contrast that against volume, this table over to the left shows for 2019 the amount of volume, and typically in the industry this is displayed in K-gallons, which is just simply thousands of gallons per customer. So this shows the total amount of gallons by customer. And if I do a similar proportioning off to the right, what's really fascinating to me when I look at this is, while single family is so dominant in the connections, these other customer classes are very much represented when we start to talk about the amount of volume that they use on the system. And so single family, about 70% of the connections is only 30% of the volume. Multifamily, commercial, landscape, industrial have very significant volumes on an annual basis for the system. And we'll be updating these statistics as we go through. We expect to get more and more billing data that's current into the fiscal year as well. With regards to the financials, this particular slide is a look at the water system over the last few years and the revenues coming into the system. And so there's a couple interesting things that come out and really stand out to me on this. And what you see is since 2011, it's been relatively flat. So even when we've had small rate increases, that's declining usage has kept the revenues relatively flat. Additionally, if we look at the proportionality of where the revenue is coming from, we've got kind of two things called out here. In black, we've got the rate revenue. And so what this is the revenue that we're deriving from charging services. So whether that's the fixed monthly fees or the volumetric charges, that is the primary source of revenue for the water fund. And when we go to sewer, you'll see it's very similar. And that goes along with the theme we've talked about. These are enterprise funds. Often referred to as business-like entities, meaning that their accounting is completely separate from the city, and charges for services, the use of those services, are the primary driver of revenue to cover the operating expenses. If we go to the next slide, the other side of the equation is the expenditures. And so a couple different components here. We've talked about a few of those, and Andy teed it up in that honeycomb chart that we had initially. We've got water resource charges. We've got operating and maintenance charges in black, and we have in the orange the debt charges, which this is the principal and interest that we're repaying on capital investments that we've made over time. If we take again that longer view and go from 11 forward, what we've seen here is just slight increases in the overall level of expenditures that the city has on an annual basis, and that kind of goes to the theme of the underlying cost of doing business. Tends to increase as we go over time. So we displayed a little chart like this before. It just kind of shows up the buildup for FY21, moving 1 year forward, of the big cost requirements that are within this fund. Debt, capital, and operating are the often ones we talk about, and they're pretty large amounts on an annual basis that we need to cover. With regards to capital, that can be one of the more dynamic components, and it's one as we do these studies, we spend a lot of time interfacing with staff to try to understand the investments that are required for the system into the future and each year, because that effectively makes up one of the more dynamics or parts that's changing year by year that we need to ensure we account for, and that revenues are there to provide for this investment such that the level of service can be maintained on the system. So this chart right here, we just broke down for the next few years what the big components of investment that are proposed to be made. And so you can see in orange here, this is distribution and transmission. What we're really talking about here is the buried parts of the water infrastructure system that are getting the water from the treatment plants out to the individual businesses and homes that are using it. In blue, you can see some of the treatment components. And then we've got wells, cap water leases, and some other miscellaneous storage and pumping expenses. And so very dynamic investment schedule that's meeting the needs. As we mentioned, some of the ones that come up that we often talk about are renewal and replacement. And so making sure on the distribution and transmission side that we're reinvesting and replacing those pipes before they reach the end of their useful life. So future capital funding sources, and this is something that we brought up in the last discussion. When utilities go out to do these capital projects, there's a decision has to be made about how to fund those. And so on this particular chart, what we're showing is the three different mechanisms or sources of funds that we have to fund the ongoing capital program. In gray is the cash. So this is cash coming from rates on an annual basis or fund balance, if we have some excess fund balance. In black is debt. I mentioned Tempe's in a very good situation with regards to its ability to borrow at a very cheap cost to put infrastructure in the ground and then repay that in the future with principal and interest. And then at the bottom are system development fees. And that's simply fees that we get from new connections on the system with some infill in the city that helps growth pay for growth. So when a new connection adds on, they help fund some of the infrastructure that goes to serve them. So water status quo. The next slide I'll go in and we're going to go to the financial model now to look at our projections. But a status quo is really a diagnostic view to say, what happens if we essentially take our current revenue projections, which are $52 million, our current expenditures, and our capital investment, those three things, hold them flat for the foreseeable future. What does our projection look like? Are we in need of any increases, or do we have a sustainable situation? You can see down here in the bottom, we've highlighted kind of is a deficit that would be generated from that if we weren't to make a change. So if I go to our financial model, this will become a little bit clear. And so what this is we've created a 10-year financial model where we put all of these assumptions in: customers, volumes, revenues, expenditures, and capital investments. And then we essentially are able to play it forward with this to look for the next 10 years with the various assumptions and base data that's in here, the health of the financial system. And so just a few things to orient us. Up top, you can see in this diagnostic view, we've just assumed that revenues are flat. So we've got 0 increases in here for water rates. On the operating fund chart over here, this is very much like our bank account. This is how much money we have. We have about $50 million at the end of 19 going forward, and this is the ending balance in each year, the projection. Now in the middle is really the most critical graph as we start to talk about the sustainability of revenues and expenses on an ongoing basis. In orange is the cash coming out. In black is the cash coming into the system. So just like your personal bank account, if we have a difference like this, it's got to come from somewhere, and it's coming from, in this case, the operating fund. So as we have a difference we need to make up, we're pulling down the operating fund, and you can see in this particular case, if revenues are flat, but we need to make the necessary investments in our infrastructure down below here with the CIP funding and fund operations, we would see an ongoing deficit that, if it were allowed to go on, would by 2024, we would be underneath this black line, which is our minimum balance we would like to hold on. And if we were to go to 2025, we would actually see balances go negative. Now, while that's not a reality that could actually occur, this trajectory kind of shows us the rate at which we're burning cash, and that we would actually go below our defined targets and into a minimum situation. And so the next scenario that one might want to look at is say, well, what's required just in time when the need arises to fix this situation? And so what we can see in this particular situation is, if I start again up here on this top table, you can see water increases. Now, instead of 0, what we've done is we've asked the model to fix this deficit on a just-in-time basis. And what you can see is in 21, it has a 0%, and 22 a 0. But then in 23, as we started to see those balances come down very quickly to our minimum, and had we done nothing, would have been negative going into the future, you can see the model starting to correct by increasing revenues. And so in this just-in-time version, it's increased revenues by 10.4% in 23. In fiscal year 24, you can see a pretty large adjustment of 43%. And if I go to the revenues versus expenditures, you can see our ongoing deficit. But as our balances start to hit that target, you can see now in the black line, instead of being flat, you can see it's crossing over in order to make up the deficit we've created and create a sustainable plan going forward. So this is one solution. It's a little bit rough, what we like to think of as far as a rate shock, when you allow cash flow deficits to accrue over time and then have to fix it. It requires a lot of upward motion in 1 year in order to fix that problem very quickly and not allow balances to go negative. And so a third scenario, a different way to look at this, is oftentimes communities will take a more predictable approach when they identify that there are these funding gaps in future years, and try to levelize the plan of increases such that in each year they're lower, but allow us to meet the same targets. And so what we've come up with in this plan, and I have to say this is as it is today, as we continue to update these models and get additional data, we will continue to sharpen our pencil and refine these estimates. But what we're showing today is in FY21, a 5.5% annual increase in revenues. And if we carry that forward out each year, what you can see happens is we will still start to erode some fund balance. But as we get to 2025 and forward, you can see that curve starts to bend. And so by doing this plan of annualized increases, we can slowly start to adjust and realign the revenues. And if I go to the middle chart, you can kind of see now the black line has a slope on it to the right, a soft slope, where as we get into the middle of the 2020s, we're starting to get those expenditures and revenues in alignment. I mean, by the end of the period, we've got a little bit, we've made up our fund balance. And so essentially this is a measured approach to get us in alignment with our expenditures and revenues over a multi-year period, and allows customers some predictability in the level of rate increases that we would see now. We update this every so often so that you can bring in additional data. So it's not like you would necessarily just lock a plan like this in. It's a fact that as you bring in new data and understanding on the system, you continue to update the underlying assumptions and forecasts such that you can continue to adjust that trajectory and make sure that these two lines are meeting in the long term and are sustainable. As Andy mentioned, and wanted to pop this chart up one more time, that overall level of increases in water and sewer is typically above the background inflation that you see overall. When we think of inflation, I'd say maybe the 2% level. We typically think of water and sewer, and the blue line captured this being the kind of annual increases in water rates across the country as a bit higher. And so it's typically above 4% and 5% in the last few years, and you can see how it trends with regards to the underlying inflation. So, point being, the level of increases we're seeing on the system right now as projected are very much in alignment with this industry metric and what we see overall in the industry. So I think with that, I'll take a quick break. It's kind of a natural segment before we move on to the sewer system. Are there any questions on those scenarios that I went through? Or any of the data we just presented? We can go back and talk about it and just make sure there's a full understanding on it, and then move on to the sewer system. And Steve, do you have any questions in your chat box at all?
No, Kyle, I have none. Delia asked a question prior to the meeting started, but I think we'll hold off till later because it's a little bit different than what we're covering right now.
Okay.
Oh, wait, hang on. I got a new question. Oh, Carmen just said it's a lot of information, I think, at one time. So, but with that, I think we can proceed.
Okay. Yeah, and I would agree. It is a lot of information, and so we'll continue moving though. Very similar discussion, parallel discussion on the sewer side. So I think some of this information will be reiterated, just with a different vantage point, looking at the sewer system this time. And so what we're looking at on the sewer system, again, just to give you some ideas of scope and scale of the system, is wastewater treated flows about 29 million gallons a day, 495 miles of sewer lines, $145 million of capital investment in the next 5 years, about 40,000 active accounts. And so very similar kind of to water, a little bit different, but a very similar size and scope, meeting the community's wastewater needs. So how many customers do we have in representation? You can see over to the left, I've got a very similar table that we had before. We do have, we've highlighted the big four customer classes here. Tempe does have a sub aggregate underneath commercial. There are a few other customer classes that come in there that go down to a little bit of a different, a higher level of detail. But in total, again, if I go to my proportion, in talking in big numbers, single family is by far the largest customer representation on the sewer system, followed closely by multifamily and commercial, as well as some industrial flows. If we talk about how much wastewater we use, our water that's used and then returned to the wastewater system, off to the left, I've got the table again showing this in thousands of gallons. And it's a very similar kind of conversation that we were talking about before, except the proportions are even a little bit different here. So again, single family is very represented in the number of connections, but when we talk about volumes, they're only about 20%. Multifamily is 25%, and in commercial in the Tempe makes up a large proportion of the volumetric flows on an annualized basis, followed by industrial. So with regards to the revenues, what we've done is broken this out again, very similar to the discussion on water. In black, I'm showing the rate revenue starting in fiscal year 11, moving forward to fiscal year 20 projected. and the other revenues. And it's a very similar discussion as we've had before. These revenues have been relatively flat. So you see some movement up and down, little variations depending on usage and any rate increases that had taken place. But the overall picture, if you look over that long term, is relatively flat. If we look at the overall expenditures, similar to water in the sense that we have the same breakdown. If you see, we've got debt in orange, in black, we've got other operating. And then as we mentioned early on, there is a unique cost here, which is the fact that the city of Tempe sends its flows for treatment to what is termed here SHROG, which is a sub-regional operating group. And so this is an agglomeration of communities that pool their wastewater to one central treatment facility. And so that cost comes back into the system for the cost of treating wastewater. Overall, kind of long-term trends, slight increases in cost if you were to draw a line there from 2011 to 2020, but costs have been relatively contained here. We haven't seen huge amounts of increase year over year or over the long term, relatively muted. Again, the big picture of cost to drain a tub, debt service going into FY21 about 16 million, capital 8 million, and operating 14 million. Future capital projections by type. And so if we take this one, this is breaking down the investments that we need to make in the sewer system on a go-forward basis. In green, I've highlighted here about $58.1 million of SHROG. And so mentioned the flows go for treatment to the sub-regional operating group. That group comes up with a defined schedule of capital improvements that need to be made at the treatment plant. And those costs then come back to Tempe prorated for their share. So Tempe essentially pays for the capital investments that are needed to treat its flows that it sends to the plant. In addition, we've got water reclamation, capital investments, capacity. And then one of the other ones as well, similar to the water side, is collection and conveyance. And so this is the buried infrastructure that is receiving wastewater and then transmitting it across the system to be treated. Future capital funding sources, very similar outlook to water here. We've got the three sources highlighted being cash in gray. In black is the annual amount of borrowing that's projected to meet capital investment needs. That's our largest source of funding. And then in orange is any system development fees that we've accrued and we can apply toward capital investments in the future. So the sewer status quo, where does the rubber meet the road? We've got right now in 2020 about $33 million in expenses. The expenditures are about $38 million. The capital investment plan is $231 million. And so if we take those all together and plan forward, we've got about a $12 million funding gap here. So a little bit more of a stable outlook, very similar to what we had talked about last time as compared to water. And so if I go to the financial panel again to kind of take a peek at our projections going forward, this is the status quo. And so with the sewer rate increases held flat, 0 over time, what we can see if we go to the operating fund, we have a relatively sustainable period, except for in the last few years. And so in the last few years, you can see as we go forward, what would happen is we're projecting some operating expenditure increases, as well as some big capital items that are distributed in the middle of the time period we're projecting, which is leading us to deplete some of the fund balances. And you can see we have a downward trajectory that's further out than water toward the end of the decade. And so the next question might be, what would that take to fix that just in time? And what you can see here is the model solving this in each year, and we've got zeros for each year going forward. But as we get to FY29, which is what we were showing, that downward trajectory that would go below our minimum, the model has solved for an increase in that year that would fix the problem if we waited till 2029, which would be roughly a 30% increase in the amount of revenue that we would need. And you can see that kind of, hockey stick on the end here as that revenue readjusts to try to meet the capital expenditure so that we have a hallmark of a sustainable plan with cash out being on top of cash in. And then finally, the levelized plan. So what would we need to do if we started to pull this forward a little bit, such that we didn't need to do such a large increase all in 2029? And what we're showing in this particular plan is we've got 0% rate increases going forward, but we've started in 2026 a policy of an inflationary increase right around 3% carrying forward. And now that's had the effect, if I come over here to the operating fund, of starting to curtail some of that depleting fund balance. So you can see we still have a downward trajectory, but it's softer than before. And in the very last year, we're right about at that target. And so if we go over to the operating fund expenses, you can see how the black line is starting to slope up in those last few years to meet the orange line. And kind of in a situation like this, what we're really looking at is trying to determine in what year that should start, those increases, and what magnitude they are. And so the kind of big picture takeaway is the sewer system is in really good shape as it goes forward for the next 5 years or so. But then likely sometime in the future, we're going to need inflationary level of increases for a number of years to ensure that we don't build up too much pressure underneath the surface that would then need to be made up with a larger increase. So trying to avoid that large rate shock situation or increase in 1 year. And so as these numbers continue to update and this analysis and projections are updated year by year, we expect to see these numbers move slightly or rearrange slightly depending on the underlying cost. But it's likely in the last 5 years that we would see that pressure. Again, just the commentary that typically we see, pretty good inflation. And so the real takeaway on the sewer side is, you're not seeing necessarily that kind of inflation come in the underlying expenses or in the makeup of the capital program that's causing us to do rate increases at a high inflationary level right now. That's a very sustainable system on a go-forward basis and likely will not need increases in the near future. So Steve, I think I'll stop here. I know that's a lot of information on the two systems and the revenue projections, but happy to go back, talk about it. If there's any questions, happy to bounce back to those slides and dig into it in more detail or talk about it.
And as previously stated, if you want to unmute and ask your question, you can, or you may use the chat feature and ask your question that way. As of right now, I'm not seeing anything, Kyle, but we can wait another 30 seconds.
Yeah, let's give a second.
Kyle, this is Taria. I have a question that we made a change in that wastewater rate applying the cap for the residential customers. Did that have any kind of impact on this rate study this year?
You're referring, and I think just to be clear for the group, what we're referring to here is there's a practice in place where for sewer billing, we rely on the winter average. What we essentially mean there is we look at your water consumption in the winter months to determine the sewer billing throughout the year, which helps us avoid charging customers for seasonal irrigation demands that might increase water demands temporarily, but are not necessarily returned to the sewer system. And there was a change made where, as we mentioned early on, there's this data point industry-wide where indoor usage has been declining over a number of years. And what that's led to is declining wastewater returns as well. And so as we went to update those rates, the averaging has decreased slightly. And that has, Taria is included within this analysis, and the revenues have been updated. And it does, I believe, slightly, and I can pull the exact number Deb might have, it does slightly decrease the revenue generation of the system over time. And it's something that we've seen in a number of different funds that cap would be lowered as indoor usage contracts. And so it's definitely included and something we watch as part of the projections.
Thank you, and thank you for explaining the winter average as well for the audience and all of us.
Absolutely.
I have no other questions at this time, Kyle.
Okay, we'll keep moving forward. What we thought we'd do is move on to a couple of other slides here, and these are really kind of indicative results. And so what we want to do is, the question is always when we start talking about rate increases is how does that impact customers? And so the first caveat here, I'm going to show you some kind of bill impacts to start to get us oriented to how we think about this and how this impacts various different types of customers at different usage levels. But as we go through the study, obviously we're only in the first component. And so as we go through cost of service and rate design, decisions down the road there might change this outlook. And especially as we talk about in fiscal year 21, when rate changes might be made or different distinct choices might come up where it might impact a customer differently. But with that one caveat, what I wanted to show you is these indicative levels of uses. And so what we've got up here is a customer that's using about 10,000 gallons of monthly water use and 7,000 gallons of monthly sewer use. This is kind of a typical residential bill in Tempe. And so what we can see here is the bill broken out between the water section that we had forecasted some rate increases on. So you can see that bill changing as we go forward. The sewer, which in the near term is flat, so it's at $23.18, and then the total bill, which in fiscal year 20 is about $50.44, and in fiscal year 20 comes up to about $57.23. So what that would mean for the kind of typical customer is about $1.79 more a month in charges, or about 3.2% when you weight the two together. Because sewer is not changing, water is moving up at 5.5. The overall average is lower, and so the change in the bill is a little bit lower. But it's nice to bring that together to what you would see and what you would get in the mail as a typical customer. Now, we also recognize that there are a number of customers on the system that may not be typical and use different usage amounts. And so this particular bill scenario is showing a customer that uses a higher amount of usage. And so in this case, we've got, again, a 5/8 meter connection with about 70,000 gallons of monthly water use. And so likely here we've got a situation where there's some seasonal irrigation demands being used by the customer. Their sewer has been capped here kind of at 12,000. And what we see there is on a go forward basis, the water bill is a larger proportion of the overall customer's bill. And so as we increase the rates on water while sewer stays flat, we would see a $17 change in this monthly bill, and it would be about a 5% increase. And so it just tries to help us understand the dynamics. If water is a larger part of the bill and there's some increases on that side, that'll translate to a more increase on the overall bill that a customer would see. And again, caveat being, as we go through the next few parts of the components of the analysis, there may be decisions that would change the ultimate impacts. But these are, again, just kind of showing you how these revenue changes would filter through to customers if the rate structure remained the same. How does this compare? So what we've done then is just taken that typical residential bill and stacked it up against a number of peer municipalities that are within the valley. And what we can see here is that the average is about $79.93, but the typical bill, we're pretty close to the bottom of that survey. There are quite a number of communities that are actually above us when we combine the sewer and water bill together to come up with that average typical bill in these different communities. Another thing to note is, it's not always a peer-to-peer comparison. Well, this is useful. These typically change from year to year as communities make adjustments. They're under the similar pressure as the city of Tempe is with regards to the underlying characteristics like aging infrastructure and the need for capital investments. And so this might change year to year. There might also be some different level of service that comes in under the hood. So just a caveat as we talk about the different comparisons we might make. If we take the larger bill, so this is the bill that has 70,000 gallons of water use and 12,000 of sewer use, we brought this one into the equation and stacked it up against other communities and put that same amount of usage in these communities to see where that might come out. And the average bill is about $364. And we're slightly under that, still in a very similar position where we're kind of, if you take the midpoint, on the lower side of the communities that are serving customers within the valley. And so still in a good position from a peer comparison standpoint.
Hey, Kyle, we have a question.
Sure.
Julianne asks, is 10K gallon a month a typical bill for these communities?
So it's a typical bill for Tempe. And then what we've done is applied that usage amount in these other communities to create a comparable bill. But in those individual communities, their average bills might fluctuate a little bit differently depending on their underlying customers. So they may have smaller homes or less irrigation demands, or older areas or newer areas. And so their average bill might slightly fluctuate. I would think, though, that most times, because we're talking about residential customers, those usage amounts on a monthly basis for the typical are going to be very, very similar to one another on average. But we have to set it kind of at your average to create a comparison.
Hi, Kyle. This is Steve. And just since I've reviewed most of the other Valley cities' most recent rate studies, I have a pretty good idea of what they have for their typical bill. A lot of communities have a 9,000 water to 6,000 gallon typical usage. Scottsdale has an 11,000 and 8,000 is their typical usage. So it's really right in the same range as what we have at 10 and 7. Kyle, we have another question. Why are Tempe's rates for higher users so much higher than Gilbert's and Chandler's?
And I think that goes back to probably the initial slide we had where we had tiered rates for consumption. And so as we move into the next components of the analysis, we're really going to be digging into how we structure those rates and the components that go into them. I guess that the question to answer is twofold. So one is, on this comparison, which shows a pretty large user, the actual bill that comes out is relatively comparable. The tier breakpoints and pricing, though, for Tempe, we have a configuration in Tempe where we're trying to properly assign the cost of providing service. And when we get into that cost of service, we're going to really take a deep dive into this. And that Rates 101, I went through this where we use an industry standard approach that's called base plus extra capacity, which identifies the base level of cost to provide average demands, but then also peak demands are a huge cost driver in the water side. And in the case of Tempe, we've made a critical methodology approach where we're trying to assign that cost of peaking to the people and the customers who are peaking on the system. And so we typically find a lot of that peak usage occurring in the top tiers of usage, typically related to seasonal changes in demand that happen that the system must be sized to meet year round when they occur. And so when we get into the next analysis, I'm really going to show you exactly how those cost numbers flow through to create those rates and how we identify those.
And Kyle, if I could just hop in too, you're exactly right. Back to the Rates 101 presentation, we had the slide that kind of showed the different tiered structures for the agencies. And so communities like, Tempe and Scottsdale and Peoria and Mesa and Surprise and Phoenix, they have inclining block rate structures or seasonal rate structures where that higher usage, that rate on average is about, $5 or $6, 1,000 gallons. Chandler and Gilbert have very, very modest inclining block rate structures where that top tier rate only gets into the $2 to $3 range. So that's really the big difference. So just wanted to kind of hit that a little bit more specifically and directly, but you were spot on in terms of the why.
This is Kathleen. Can you hear me?
We can. You're a little bit soft. We couldn't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me better now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So my question to you is, I know I've sat through several city council meetings on, why those higher tiers are more and why you feel the structure needs to be that way. But I just want to make sure that you guys understand that, for those of us that live in South Tempe, our lots were purchased as the city allowed them. They allowed 2 acre lots down here. In order to water an acre and a half, 2 acre lot, you're obviously going to use a tremendous more amounts of water. And to me, and this has been my beef for years, it seems like you guys have always wanted a green city. You've always wanted green landscapes. It's always been kind of an agenda item. You allowed us to purchase these large lots, and then you suddenly decided to start punishing people with larger lots and needs for water based on the fact that they have to water them. So that's the part that I want to make sure people don't forget, is that you guys created this dilemma, and now you're pushing the expenses off on the people who purchased years ago. We've been in this home for over 25 years, 26 something. And it is aggravating when our costs are just astronomically higher than they used to be, based on the new criteria that you guys are using as you make these rate decisions. And I mean, we've even heard people in the city say, well, maybe we can do 2 different meters, one for landscape and one for water usage. I don't use very much water in my home at all, but my landscape water usage is high. And you know, I've heard people say, well, maybe we could do 2 meters, but then I got data from the city about a year or so ago saying, yeah, that would be on you to pay for that second meter. And it was like, if I remember right, it was like $3,000 or something to pay for that second meter and have it installed. And it was ridiculous. And so I just want to make sure that people understand that you guys are thinking about that as you go through these rate structures, and understand that I mean, I'm not the only one that feels this way in South Tempe, believe me. There's a lot of us down here because there's a lot of large lots. And it seems inappropriately, it seemed, what's the word I want to say here? It's just an extreme as to how much more we are paying per gallon to water our lawns. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this is Andy. I appreciate those points. I think one of the things that also came about as part of the last rate structure as well, to your comment specifically about the separate irrigation meter, was, as Taria brought up, capping sewer at 12,000 gallons a month, not just using just simply the winter average in case there was some, you know, outdoor use or irrigation happening in those months, you know, that may otherwise be also, you know, inequitably influencing a higher volume for sewer use, or for sewer volume that's returning to the system. And so that was an adjustment that was made last time, you know, recognizing those types of conditions. And so I think as part of this study, you know, considering lot size and looking at tiers as we get into cost allocation and rate design discussions, you know, I think these are great things for stakeholders to really offer opinions, much like you've done, about different considerations and things that we can look at. And what Kyle's really saying is that we just want to make sure that when we look at different breakpoints of tiers, you know, we have a good understanding of how to assign the cost to those different usage levels, recognizing how they influence our system. And so I think there's a good process here that we can look at and explore alternatives. I think all Kyle's really saying is that from a cost of service perspective, you know, that's what we've been trying to maintain, is cost of service and equity throughout. And if we're not quite there, you know, let's explore some alternatives that can maybe continue to improve upon things.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I just, the one thing that was very frustrating to me through this whole process the last 3 years that I've been involved in the water part is that, you know, I get that those extra meters are expensive, but I personally, and this is nobody else's opinion, but I personally feel like the city has kind of created this problem for those of us down in South Tempe. And if you guys need to eat the cost of the additional sewer or the additional meters for the homes and get them set up, I personally feel like that's an expense to the city. I mean, you guys have created this, and I'm more than happy to pay for the water that I have to water my land, but it's either spend the money on the water, or get rid of all the green. And I know neighbors that have torn their trees out because their water costs have gone up so high. So, you know, we don't want to see brown Tempe. and I just think that somewhere the city's got to meet us at least halfway on this. So anyway, thank you for taking that into consideration.
Kyle and Andy, Stacy asked a question regarding, do we have a slide comparison for commercial customers, for a large commercial customer? And I don't believe we have one as part of this presentation, but I think we can put one together and send it out after.
Yeah, we absolutely could. So the big nuance on commercial is that usage levels can vary widely from one commercial use to the next, and so oftentimes it's harder to come up with a representative typical bill like we just did, where we can say, hey, a lot of homeowners or residential customers would experience this. As we go into the next sections, we can talk about some representative commercial. We'll be showing you some of that, but we're more than happy to pull a couple out, Steve. We can follow up with what those would look like.
Sounds good. Julianne asked the question, does Chandler use gray water? May I address that issue? Question mark. And obviously our consultants wouldn't know that, but I'm not aware that Chandler uses any gray water. They do have reclaimed water, but that's a completely separate system that they have a separate rate for. And then Carmen just wrote a question too. Let me read it real quick. So far, what I'm understanding is that the city of Tempe has a great debt. It is very difficult for the city to maintain the water system. What is causing the income not to cover those costs? Does it cost a lot of money to bring water to the desert? I suppose the debt has been increasing year after year, and it will continue to increase. What is needed? Question mark. Increase prices, reduce the amount of water you offer, maybe think about restricting certain uses of water, or start charging more for water for certain uses. There is a lot of questions in there. My apologies.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to take on a few of those that I heard, Steve, that have a theme. So you definitely, cap water costs are a cost that come to you. You don't have control for that, and that is the cost of moving water across the desert from really the Colorado River all the way over to the valley for your portion of that. That is a cost that does typically increase, but I wouldn't say the cost that we've seen increase, Steve, have been too crazy over the last few years. It's been relatively stable, slight increases on that one. The debt profile has actually been, and as we project it out, is relatively stable. So the interesting thing about the debt is, while we're funding capital improvements with debt, we're also paying that debt off. And so as we borrow new money, we have to repay that. But also as we get to the end of a term of loans we've made in the past, that debt falls off. And what we try to do, and as we put into our models, we look at that projection of debt service over time. And actually, if I go back real quick, I can show you exactly what this looks like. I've actually got it broken out. Let me go to the water system real quick, since that's the one we had the increases on. You can kind of see here in the red right here, this is the ongoing debt profile. So this is the expenditure by each year of debt expenses. And so while it might increase a little bit here or there, the actual profile, this gap of this red, is relatively flat over the projection period. And that's because when you get under the hood and you look at the assumptions, we actually pay off some debt that frees up room and cash flow for additional borrowing that we need to do to fund investments in the near term for capital investments. And so that typically is kind of a stable situation. The real driver oftentimes is the ongoing O&M costs and the cost of doing business that increase over time, as well as the fact that we need to fund and size this capital program, especially on the water side, to meet the reinvestment needs and replace those pipes to ensure we continue our level of service into the future.
Kyle, I'm not seeing any additional questions at the moment. However, before the meeting started, we did receive a question about agricultural properties, similar to one we had at the first meeting last week. But it sounds like we'll probably address that more in our next 2 meetings, looking at larger properties.
Yeah, I would think so, Steve. Yeah, I think where we really drill into the customer classifications, get an understanding of why we're grouping different customers together into classifications and the unique demands of serving those customers. So I think that falls really nicely into as we start to talk about cost of service and rate structure.
Carmen has another question. If the debt is stable, could we think about investing in the quality and improving the taste of the water? That's an operational question. Tara, would you like to tackle that one?
Yes. Okay. Sorry about that. I had to get everything on. So thank you for the question, Carmen. And I do assure you that the quality of Tempe's water, it meets all EPA, ADEQ standards. It is very high quality water. And if you do have more questions on that, obviously you can reach out to me. We can, get you values, numbers, specific concerns with the water we can address. But the quality, like I said, does meet all ADEQ, EPA, and local standards. As far as the taste of the water, I think I'd need more specifics on that because I know there's some times of the year, which I'd like to address, where you get that musty, moldy taste. And I don't know if that's what you're talking about, maybe in the summer months. And then what we'll do is we'll turn carbon on at the plants, and that'll get rid of that taste and odor. But that's MIB and jasmine, and it's naturally occurring in the water. It's perfectly safe. We do invest, Tempe does invest, and I'm proud of that we do feed the carbon to get rid of that taste. It's an aesthetic thing, and so it's not actually necessary. But hopefully that answers your question. Again, please feel free to reach out to me if you have specifics on quality water.
Tara, can I just add to that also for Carmen, for the group, that also would definitely refer them also to the consumer confidence report that we publish each year. If there's any questions about quality and such. But just on the taste and odor question, this is a sort of an age-old question in the valley, as Tara was describing, the nature of our surface water and not only the chemistry of it, but also what happens with it biologically as we move through the seasonal changes that we see here in Arizona, has the effect of creating those types of situations. Again, the water itself and the quality of the water that leaves our facilities meets or exceeds all standards, but there aren't standards necessarily for taste and odor. As well, there's some challenges that we, not just Tempe, but across the valley, as we use chemicals for disinfecting, there's an effect that it has on the taste of water versus what you might taste directly out of maybe a groundwater well back east, or system that has water softener or something like that. So it is a challenge, but from purely a quality standpoint, it's as high quality of water as you can find anywhere in the U.S. And the things we do to try to some extent mitigate those tastes and odors, as Tara mentioned, are carbon feeding during certain times of the year and trying to be cognizant of that as we move through those seasons. So we do invest, but taking it to a different level than that, and the amount of investment that has been certainly researched and analyzed, and cost effectiveness discussed, and it's such a large investment for such a short period, and what you achieve for that, it's been kind of deemed to be not a feasible or a good investment of our our capital dollars, our operating dollars. So thank you for the question, though, Carmen.
I just want to add one thing, and this is unrelated to Carmen's question, but for our commercial and industrial stakeholders who are attending as well, once we get into the cost of service and the cost allocation for all customer classes, there'll be more detail and information for commercial and industrial. So wait till the next meeting, you'll see a lot more on your side as well.
Steve, did you want to circle back to, I think it was Delia's question at the very beginning of the session that kind of, I know Kyle's got the remaining activities up and the next thing on our schedule is cost of service, and that may involve looking at different customer classifications, so that agricultural zoning question and discussion might be appropriate.
Sorry, I'm on mute. I'm sorry, Andy, I kind of missed part of that question. Could you rephrase that?
Sure, yeah, I just didn't know if we wanted to circle back to the very first question that I think Delia posted about agricultural zoning, because as we get into cost of service, you know, looking at different customer classifications such as agricultural properties, this is a good time to have that type of guidance and discussion to know if that's something that we want to look at, and if we have the data to be able to look at as part of, you know, understanding their usage characteristics and seeing if separate customer classifications might be appropriate.
That's a good question. As far as our land use and zoning is concerned, as far as how, I mean, we'll probably need to go back and actually take a look at our city charter to kind of go back and define what's single family versus non-residential. And I'm not sure we have the data, but I will look into that this week to see if I can, if I have sufficient data to really dig into that at the level we need to dig into. Terry, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I would say just, I'm not sure either, Steve, but I agree. We would have to just kind of outside of this meeting, figure out what we've got access to and what kind of data we have within the city. And then we can probably, if we have that, we can discuss that with the group.
Does anyone else have any more questions?
Maybe Steve, as Kyle was saying, for the kind of this revenue sufficiency discussion or revenue requirements, it's, you know, used an analogy like our checkbooks. And I think that's, you know, this is probably the, most relatable part of the rate making process in terms of, knowing what our expenses are and, what we have to do to cover those expenses and doing planning. I think from that perspective, it's somewhat familiar and probably more straightforward than, what the cost of service and rate structure conversations will be like. That's probably a little bit unfamiliar to folks. And so I know we touched on those in the Rates 101 conversation just last week, but I suspect we'll probably have a fair amount more of discussion and questions on cost of service and how we're doing those allocations and some of the process that underlies that, and similarly on rate structure. So I suspect we'll probably be amplifying the questions as we move into the subsequent workshops, I would imagine.
I agree. Well, with that, and seeing no further questions, Terry, did you want to close the meeting, or?
Sure. Yeah. I just wanted to thank everyone again for their involvement in this process and being part of the stakeholder group. There are a lot of questions that it's very educational for myself, and I'll speak for Tara as well, to understand this process like you're understanding it, but also kind of addressing questions that have been perhaps asked previously, but so we all have a better understanding of the nature of the situation. And I guess I'll make just one comment about, I think it was from a question that came earlier, and maybe it was Carmen, but there was a comment made about, or question asked about, whether we have difficulty achieving our, financial needs. It's not really a question of difficulty. It's sort of as Andy, I think, mentioned, or Kyle, it's a continuum. So as you can imagine, we're continually operating a system that requires funding to be able to finance and pay for items. It's also a system that requires a continuous capital improvements, whether they be replacements or upgrades or other things. So it's not we find ourselves in a position where we're unable to pay for, but we have to be able to also plan and project for the future, because we know that, as you've seen throughout this presentation and the previous, the costs of doing business, the cost of commodities and materials and other resources continue to increase, sort of as a typical part of our economic conditions. So we're trying to do things that do this in a very responsible way, but also in a very fair and equitable way, and try to balance all of these different components as we look at what it takes to sufficiently fund this operation that we have. So it's very important, and again, your input as the people who are on the ultimate end of the service and are being provided the service, it's very important that we hear your questions, but also your input and your thoughts, and answer questions, probably more importantly, so you understand what it is we're trying to do and why we do this process in the first place. So just want to thank you again, and we look forward to your additional questions moving forward. And if there are questions that we didn't answer sufficiently, feel free to reach out to any of us on the staff, as we mentioned previously. But we look forward to our next meeting and seeing or hearing all of you there. So have a good rest of your day, and thank you again.